How long does it take to learn a Chinese character or word? It varies, but some vocabulary just refuses to stick, no matter what you do. These are called leeches, and if you don't deal with them, they'll suck you dry. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about tricky vocabulary, so characters and words that you try to learn but which just refuse to stick. And I don't mean that you encounter a new character or word and find it hard to commit to memory. I mean that you keep forgetting something while reviewing. Maybe you do learn the character and you get it right a few times, but then you forget it again. Such vocabulary items are often called leeches, and they can become a big problem if you have many of them. Something that makes leeches devious is that often you are not aware that you have them or how serious they are. The definition is, after all, that it's something that you do remember most of the time, it's just that you keep forgetting them at some point, so you need to relearn them over and over. And if there is enough time between each time this happens, you might not realize how often it happens or how much of your total study time these leeches take up. If you're relying on flashcards to learn and remember Chinese vocabulary, it could be that a significant portion of your time in your flashcard app consists of relearning things you've already learned, and this is clearly not good. Leeches are not only a problem for students who use flashcards, of course. If you keep forgetting what a character means when reading, for example, you will waste a lot of time looking it up over and over. In this episode, I want to talk about leeches and what to do about them, because simply repeating them or reviewing them over and over is kind of by definition an approach that doesn't work, so we need something else. Before we talk about killing leeches, though, let's talk a little bit more about the problem itself. I think all students have encountered leeches, even if you might not call them that. But it's very hard to know what makes a specific word a leech, and a word that is very tricky for me to remember might be easy for you, and vice versa. Leeches are pretty harmless on their own, but they can be deadly in packs. Based on my own statistics for learning vocabulary in Chinese, it seems like a leech can take 10 times longer to learn, and at the end you haven't really learned it either, because you still might forget it again and again and again. If you only have a single leech, that probably doesn't impact your learning that much, and even if you have 10, it might not be such a big problem. But if you have 100 or many hundreds of leeches, this starts to seriously impact your ability to learn new words and maintain and review the other words that you have learned. This is not only about the opportunity cost. I mean, it's kind of obvious that if you didn't spend all that time on the leeches, you could have learned more words or done something else that's more useful for advancing your Chinese. But it's also about motivation, because dealing with leeches or not dealing with them and failing them over and over can be very frustrating. Few things related to learning Chinese annoy me more than forgetting how to write a certain character for the 12th or 50th time. So how do we avoid this? How do we kill the leeches? Well, the first step is to identify them or spot the leeches. This sounds like it would be easy, and in some cases it is easy. You might realize that you've missed this character many times, especially if the interval between each failure is short. However, as I mentioned earlier, it can also be very tricky, and you likely underestimate how many leeches you have if you just rely on your intuition or your perception when you study the characters and review them. Again, I'll provide a personal example, and I regard myself as someone who's fairly observant as a student because I study my own behavior and think about learning a lot. But the first time I checked in Anki how many leeches I had and how many repetitions I had for each leech, I was shocked. The worst offender had almost 100 reviews, which is a ridiculously high number. If you're curious, the character in question is Hun, as in Hun-an, as in dim or gloomy, and I have no idea why this character just refuses to stick. As mentioned earlier, the tricky bit here is that you usually get these characters right a few times, enough to think you know them, and then after maybe months you forget them again. And you can do this for years without really realizing how many such characters you have, and how much time you're wasting on leeches. If you're using Anki to study Chinese, you can just check how many leeches you have and how many times you reviewed each item, but many flashcard apps don't have this feature, which makes it harder to spot them. Naturally, there is no universal definition of what a leech is and how many times you should forget something before it becomes a leech, but the threshold in Anki is 8. This might sound like a low number, but we're talking about lapses here, and a lapse in Anki is when you forget something that you haven't learned recently, and this includes relearning if you forget it. So for example, if you forget the character Hun, and then you forget it immediately again, this is still just one lapse. You need to relearn it and then forget it again for this counter to go up. When this number reaches 8, or whatever other threshold you have specified, Anki will automatically suspend the card, i.e. take it out of your review cycle. I mentioned this in Anki because this is the right way to approach the problem, and I know that some students get annoyed that things are suspended without them having chosen them to be suspended, but I think this is great. This is the first step in killing a leech. You need to spot it, and then you need to take it out of your normal routine, because clearly, by definition, that isn't working. Another thing that can make spotting leeches harder is that it's not necessarily just one flashcard or one character. It could, for example, be that you mix up two characters without realizing it, so you get both of them incorrect some of the time, but not always, because, well, if you're guessing, for example, it's 50-50. Or if you think you kind of know which one is which, you might get it right 90% of the time, which means you will still fail this character often enough for it to be a problem, and for both of these characters to become leeches. There's no quick fix for this other than being mindful of the issue and paying attention when you're reviewing. If you think you were right, but you were actually wrong, try to figure out what happened. Try to trace your error to its source. I said earlier that we can't really predict or explain why a specific vocabulary item becomes a leech, and I think this is also highly individual. But there are a few factors that contribute to creating leeches, and being aware of these also make it easier to deal with the leeches. The most common issue is weak understanding. This is particularly a problem if you rely a lot on flashcards and maybe add words from a list or something like that. Then you will sometimes just throw a bunch of cards into your flashcard app and hope that that will teach you how to use them, how to read them, etc. And this sometimes works, but for leeches it clearly doesn't work. So you never took the time to study the character properly. What are the components? How does this character actually function? And what's his history, etc., etc. So deepening your understanding about the character by studying it. Is it a compound? What are the components? What do they mean? How do they contribute to the compound? Do they contribute sound or maybe meaning, and in what way? And things like that. Another factor that can create leeches is if you use bad mnemonics. Maybe you just grabbed somebody else's mnemonic device for a specific character or word without internalizing it and making it your own. This is usually easier to spot because you will notice that the mnemonic that you had didn't work, and so you will need to find a new one. The third factor is something I already mentioned, namely mixing up similar characters or words. This can also happen for components within compounds, so you think it's one component, but it's actually something else. And there might be a reason you are mixing them up. Maybe this other character that you wrote, which is incorrect, also exists. Maybe there are two characters that are very similar and mean different things. Or maybe they are variants of the same character. And so looking this up and tracing your errors is super important. You should also try to avoid learning things that are very similar at the same time, because there is ample research into vocabulary acquisition that shows that if you learn similar words that look similar, are pronounced similarly, mean similar things, etc., they are also then easier to mix up later. This means that having a chapter dealing only with fruit in your textbook is actually quite a bad idea, or dealing with synonyms all at once is also a bad idea, unless you've studied all of them in advance. So when you're tracing your errors and looking at different variants, different characters that you might be mixing up, this is something you do when you know these characters, obviously. It's not how you learn them initially, because that will give rise to more leeches. If you want more concrete guidance here and more examples, I've written an article called 7 Mistakes I Made When Writing Chinese Characters and What I Learned from Them, where I trace every single error to its source, I explain what I do, and how I try to address the issue. And you can then apply this to your own learning, even if you're unlikely to forget the exact same 7 characters that I talk about in that article. The principles still apply. The most important thing when dealing with leeches is that you take decisive action. Not dealing with the leeches is not an option. I mean, it is an option, but it is an option that will waste you a lot of time and create a lot of frustration. So do something. And this is why it's so good that Anki automatically suspends these cards, because you shouldn't just be reviewing them over and over and keep forgetting them. You should study them and then add them back into your review cycle. Leeches don't go away on their own. You have to take action. Which actions work for you to kill leeches is a little bit hard to say. I have suggested some things that you can do, but the important thing is that you do something that isn't just your normal study routine. Naturally, you don't need to deal with leeches the moment you realize they are there, or the moment Anki, for example, flags them as a leech. You can do this once a week, maybe when you have 40 minutes on Sunday or something, where you can sit down in front of a computer with a good dictionary and look things up and sort these things out. Don't interrupt your reading or whatever else you're doing just because you found a leech. Write it down and deal with them at a specific time. Before we wrap up this episode, I'd like to mention one final way of dealing with leeches that actually works really well and is the quickest one, and that is to give up and delete the vocabulary item in question from your flashcard app. If this character or word is super important to you, obviously you shouldn't do this, you should use one of the other methods, but most of the vocabulary we have added to flashcard apps for various reasons probably isn't as important as you think it is, and just deleting it will be fine. You can always add it in later if you encounter it again and want to learn it. The point I'm trying to make is that just deleting leeches can save you an awful lot of time. You don't need to do any of this tracing and so on. And you might say, yes, you are missing some learning opportunities here, but think about how many other words you can learn in this time. And these are also important for your Chinese proficiency. So just ignoring the hardest vocabulary can actually be a good option sometimes. This isn't just true for leeches, in fact, it's true for all your vocabulary, so having an active attitude towards your flashcards and the vocabulary that you're learning is important, and this also involves deleting things you don't need, or that take up too much time. So, in any case, keep your eyes peeled for leeches, take decisive action to get rid of them once and for all. A few leeches are irritating, but a throng of them will kill you. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.